Hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature, where we're looking at Catherine Malabou's book, The Ontology of the Accident. So we're beginning to wind up with this work, and we're looking at certain selected sections, of course. But the purpose of looking at Malabou is, of course, to look at a philosophical framework through which we can look at the convergence of trauma and fiction, trauma and philosophy, trauma and neuroscience, and how these different research networks sort of overlap with each other. So a large part of this book is spent looking at neurobiology and how neurobiology can learn and draw on the works of Spinoza. Right? So Spinoza appears, as you may remember, very prominently in this book, especially the concept of conatus, the innate cellular drive for self-preservation, and how that becomes not just an embedded function, but also an extended function. How do we connect socially to what is around us? How do we connect cognitively to what we see and recognize around us? That is determined by the concept, by the Spinozan idea of conatus. Right? And of course, when that disappears, that innate drive to preserve itself disappears, and the self becomes more and more liquidated. We talked about liquidation or a shutdown of the self, where it stops to connect to anything around it. Empathy disappears, and the connection disappears, engagement at an emotional level disappears, and instead what is produced is a flatness, an emotional dissipation of sorts. And in this section that we will study today, Malabou talks about dissipation to a large extent, and she's looking at trauma again not as the sort of the usual hysterical model, the usual neurotic model studied by psychoanalysis, the Freudian study of psychoanalysis, but rather she's looking at trauma as a state of emotionlessness, right? The complete disappearance of emotion, and how the cognitive flatness that is produced out of this emotionlessness can actually be, a more complex order of trauma. And if you remember the text which we have studied so far, two texts which come to mind immediately are Mrs. Dalloway by Woolf and also Toba Take Singh by Monto. Well, in both cases, in both the texts, we have characters exhibiting this emotionlessness. They are so disconnected from what is around them. They're so disengaged from what is around them that they cannot really integrate themselves socially, emotionally, and of course also existentially. If you take a look at, if you consider the existential self as a combination of all these selves, so that obviously has some kind of an impairment in terms of how it can connect to what is around it. So this concept of emotional flatness, this concept of emotionlessness, is something which Malabou talks about in great details. And as I mentioned, what she's trying to do is trying to incorporate a philosophical framework in terms of looking at the neuroscientific, the neurobiological reading of trauma. So there's this neurobiological apparatus that she draws on, and she talks about Damasio or Joseph Ledoux. Ledoux will appear here shortly, and also how that kind of research, that biological scientific research, can draw on and converge and have very significant overlap with something like Spinoza's idea of conatus, or Spinoza's idea of the relationship between emotion and cognition. And if you remember the sections where we looked at Damasio in some details, Antonio Damasio, we studied how the ability to emote plays a very important role in the ability to cognize reality. So in other words, emotion and cognition are very connected categories. So when the ability to emote or empathize begins to disappear, that affects the subject not just at a level of engagement with reality, but also the recognition of reality. So the subject fails or begins to get interrupted in their recognition of reality. And again, a classic case in point will be Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus Smith, the PTSD veteran, the post-traumatic stress disorder veteran, who just begins to disintegrate with what he sees around him. Okay, and that disintegration is important, because what happens obviously with the character in Woolf's novel is there's a degree of emotionlessness which appears. He completely liquidates his emotional self, and that obviously impairs his recognition of reality. So this connection between emotion and cognition, which is a very scientifically proven connection, is something that Spinoza seems to have anticipated in his philosophical works. And so it's no wonder that he is such a big and important figure in even neuroscience today. I mean, we have people like Damasio writing books on Spinoza, Descartes' era, looking for Spinoza. And there are lots of work done on Spinoza in recent times. And Malabou, of course, is just extending that kind of a research over here. Now, the other thing which Malabou spends a lot of time in this book is the idea of acknowledging destructive plasticity, giving it a name, giving it almost a medical legal classification. What happens when during this very high degree of destructive plasticity, when the innate character of the self, the ontology of the self, so to speak, it just changes. The self becomes something else, someone else. A complete transformation, right? It's not just a residual lingering, a residual connect to the old self. That no such thing as that. The self becomes something else. Now, it's almost like a personality change, a character change, the self change, and Malabou spent some time away talking about how that kind of metamorphosis, which is wrought by a destructive plasticity, that needs to be acknowledged and articulated and defined in medical legal terms. And the convergence of the medical and legal is interesting over here, because obviously what she's trying to do is giving it some kind of a recognition, a classification, a medical recognition, a philosophical recognition, a social recognition. That's the whole point of this book. That's the whole project of this book, the ontology of the accident. So by defining the accident as something which happens outside of the parameters of recognizable reality, what she's also doing is she's trying to give it a name. She's trying to give it an ontological framework, a medical legal classification. And this is what she says, and this should be on your screen, page 37 in this book. The changes brought about by destructive plasticity result from the divergence in the movements that constitute the changes, the disorder of its directions. So there's a degree of disorientation that happens, and the disorientation is a complete disorientation. In contemporary neurology, coldness, neutrality, absence, a flat emotional state are instances of this mode of destructive plasticity that Spinoza anticipated by envisaging the existence of a destructive metamorphic power without any possible reintegration into the thread of a life, a fate, or a true idea, right? So again, the idea of the flat emotional state that becomes a very important study in modern times, in modern neuroscience, in contemporary neurology, where coldness, neutrality, indifference, absence of any connect, emotional or whatever, to the reality around, these become very important medical symptoms. These become very important medical case studies, and that is wrought by destructive plasticity. I mean, even if you think about popular media, popular entertainment, we have films and web series and other such things made out of these characters who don't have an ability to empathize with reality, right? So the empathy becomes a very important study in modern times from a sociological perspective, from a cultural studies perspective, but also obviously from a medical studies perspective, right? The loss of empathy, the disappearance of empathy, these become very important situations. And how does that affect you at a neural level, but also at an active social level, right? Your social self begins to disappear because that is an extension of the neural self. So coldness, neutrality, or indifference, you're not taking any connect, you're not making any connect, absence of connect. So these become very important studies. Flat emotional, so it's a flatness. There's a degree of cognitive flatness that happens over here. And again, what Malabou seems to be doing over here, she's trying to connect this to Spinoza's philosophy of the destructive metamorphic power. I mean, when the conatus goes away, in other words, the innate cellular drive to preserve itself, that when that disappears, what happens then, right? And the important thing at the end of this paragraph is when she talks about how when such a state appears, when such a state is generated, that just completely does away with any possibility of reintegration. You cannot reintegrate it to the original idea, to the true idea. So it just becomes something else. It's a complete metamorphosis. And of course, if you remember, we have spent some time looking at fictional representations of these kinds of metamorphoses. And Malabou, of course, had mentioned Kafka as a very good attempt to articulate that metamorphosis. Now, what that also means, and this is what Malabou is, almost making a project out of, a very rich philosophical project, is to acknowledge the potential for such destructive plasticity, is to acknowledge what that can do to the subject, how it can affect the subject. In medical legal terms, we need to acknowledge it, we need to articulate it, we need to at least try to calibrate it in some terms, quantify, calibrate, classify in some terms, and not just look at it as some kind of an absolute monstrosity or absolute outside. So, among other things, this book is also an attempt to engage with that elsewhere of the accident, to engage with the destructive plasticity which can emerge out of such really intense accidents. So acknowledgement, and this should be on the screen, acknowledgement of the role of destructive plasticity allows us to radicalize the deconstruction of subjectivity, to stamp it anew. So again, look at the very interesting vocabulary used by Malabou. It's medical in a sense, it's using terms such as destructive plasticity, but also it heavily draws on critical theory vocabulary. So there's a destruction or deconstruction of subjectivity, right? So there's this differ thing that happens here as well, the very Derridian idea of subjectivity. And that is why I keep mentioning, and I did that quite a lot when we were studying the New Wounded, that Malabou is one of the finest philosophers who can sort of connect the Derridian critical theory along with the very hardcore medical science of brain damage, wound, trauma, etc. And that's a very rich philosophical framework, a very rich research framework. Those who are interested in trauma studies, it's a very new kind of way, new perspective into trauma, where you bring in deconstruction, you bring in critical theory, but at the same time you are situating it in very hardcore medical terms, so that becomes a very, very good frame to study. But the idea over here, the project over here, the invitation over here is to acknowledge the destructive plasticity. I mean, give it a name, right? And it allows us to radicalize the deconstruction of subjectivity, to stamp it anew, to give it a name, to give it a stamp, right? So radicalize it, so to give it a radical reconfiguration. This recognition reveals that the power of annihilation hides within a very constitution of identity, a virtual coldness that is not only the fate of the brain-injured schizophrenics and serial killers, but is also the signature of a law of being that always appears to be on the point of abandoning itself, escaping. In other words, this is a very innovative approach. So what Malabou is saying is, this emotional coldness, this destructive plasticity, this virtual coldness, is not necessarily always the cause, the result of brain damage. It's not necessarily always the cause of injury or trauma or blunt force trauma or any such thing. But it's a potential which is always already there in all of us, right? So it's something, things can trigger it. So it's not just that serial killers have it, or schizophrenics have it, or brain injured have it, or other people have unfortunate tragic accidents have it. But it's a potential, it's a signature of a law of being. So it's part of who we are. It's part of our being, the ontology of being. So in other words, this is why we begin to wind up with this book. What Malabou is saying is the ontology of the self and the ontology of the accident can be interestingly mapped onto each other. That mapping is important. That mapping is something which we ought to do, instead of keeping those completely aside or disconnect them. We can map one onto the other, and that can really bring about rich research in our understanding of self, in our understanding of trauma, in our understanding of injury, etc. So it is something which is part of the signature of the being that always appears to be on the point of abandoning itself, escaping. And this play is again very Derridian. Is that part of the being, is that part of self which is always on the verge of escaping from itself. right? That part, that component of the self, which is always trying to abandon the self, right? That potential to abandon the self, that potential to abandon or escape the original self, or to move away from the original self, that potential is always already there, right? So what this kind of a perspective in a destructive plasticity reveals is that we always carry the potential to shut down ourselves and become something else. We always carry the potential to completely do away with the core ontology of who we are and become a different self, a complete reconfiguration, as it were. So it's always on a point of abandoning itself, always on a point of escaping from itself. So that verge is important, that proximity to abandon the self, the proximity, the potential to do away with the original self, that is always already there. It's almost embedded in our system. This sort of, we are hardwired to a certain extent, and we configured to deconfigure ourselves, in other words. We configured to shut down ourselves, in other words. That potential is always there. So what Malabou is saying is that Spinoza's idea of conatus is a very important concept, because there's almost a Newtonian quality to it. So there's an action towards self-preservation, there's an action, a drive towards self-preservation, but that also produces the counteraction of liquidation, the counteraction of shutting down the self. And that potential is also there, and that potential needs to be acknowledged and articulated in recent studies in trauma. An ontology of modification must shelter this particular type of metamorphosis that's a farewell to being itself. So, the point in the self which can say farewell to itself, that should be articulated, that should be acknowledged. It must be sheltered within the idea of the self. A farewell that is not death, a farewell that occurs within life, just like the indifference of life to life, by which survival sometimes manifests itself. So she's making a very key distinction over here between farewell to the self and death. So this is not death, this is not a biological shutdown, this is not a cellular shutdown, as it were. This is more of an existential shutdown and a reconfiguration. So it's something which is part of the life, and it's the indifference of life to life, by which survival sometimes manifests itself. In other words, there are certain occasions where you can only survive by shutting down ourself. We can only survive by bringing an end to what we are, not at the level of suicide, not at the level of killing yourself, but at a level of completely changing about who we are, at a very, very fundamental, embedded level. And that's sometimes, ironically, the only way we can articulate agency, the only way we can articulate, some kind of engagement with reality. Today we see that all trauma survivors, whether of biological or political trauma, show signs of this kind of indifference. So this indifference sometimes becomes not a rejection of life, but rather this becomes a rerouting of life. This becomes a new way of finding life, a new way of finding or engaging with reality. So this indifference sometimes becomes political in a certain sense, and of course Malabou talks about not just biological but also political trauma, the indifference to the past, the indifference to oppression. The indifference can sometimes be a very key instrument of agency. The trauma survivors, people who suffered very tragic experiences due to political migration, political trauma, etc., choose to be indifferent to that, choose to be indifferent to the memory of oppression, right? And that indifference to the memory of oppression can sometimes be the only available agency that is there to those subjects. So the only thing they can do in the face of such oppression is be indifferent to it, right? So that becomes an instrument to articulate agency on certain occasions. In this sense, we must take destructive plasticity or destructive brain plasticity into account as a hermeneutic tool to understand the contemporary phases of violence. And this is where it becomes really important and almost textual in quality. A hermeneutic tool, an interpretative tool. So we need to take a look at brain plasticity not just as a medical phenomenon, not just as part of the brain damage, but also part of our textual reading of identity, a textual reading of the self. So if you look at destructive plasticity, that can help us to interpret that subject's situatedness, medically as well as politically. Why does a subject choose to articulate indifference? What are the factors informing the indifference, right? And these, this kind of engagement can help us understand the complexity around the subject, the complex political reality, the complex material reality, the complex cultural reality around the subject. So, we begin to get a fuller understanding of the subject's situatedness. So you can see again how the framework that Malabou is offering is sort of bringing in the political, the medical, the legal, the existential, because if you try to map this onto, let's say, migration trauma, if you try to map this onto, let's say, survivors trauma, people who survive genocides, people who survive, brutalities of migration and, xenophobia, and they choose to be indifferent to that, they choose not to talk about it, they choose not to articulate it. So there is this quality of shutdown. There's this quality of liquidation that is there. And it's a choice sometimes. So in other words, what Malabou is saying is that we need to take a look at brain, this destructive plasticity sometimes as an articulation of agency, as articulation of what the subject wants to do in the face of oppression, not talk about it, not engage with reality, not be, keen to connect at an emotional level, but rather to generate and produce indifference, which can be potentially subversive in quality. So I choose not to talk about it. I choose not to engage with it. I choose not to remember the political oppression I face. And this choice, in certain sense, can inform my identity, can inform my existential political identity, right? So, and a study of such indifference can become a hermeneutic tool, an interpretative method through which we can study the subject and also subject's situatedness in the complex political, medical reality around them. Okay? And then Malabou mentions Joseph Ledoux, who's famous for his works on synapses. And there are lots of books of Ledoux that you can read. Two very quick books that come to my mind is The Emotional Brain and Synaptic Self. Both are really innovative works on the idea of neurons and how neurons produces electrochemical reactions, which produce emotions, which then produce personality and a sense of self. So it's a very rich book, really. It brings in the medical, neuroscientific study of emotions, and then also looks at emotion from a slightly more philosophical framework. And by bringing these two frameworks together, it offers a very complex and full understanding of what we are, and the idea of the self, the agentic, emotional self. So this is Ledoux, and Malabou, of course, is now quoting Ledoux. You are your synapses. Joseph Ledoux's famous phrase does not only mean an assimilation of the being of the subject to the constructive plastic formation of their identity, but also the identification of being as a possibility of its own neuronal destructive plasticity. So if you look at synapses are those, faces, those joints, those nodal points between neurons, and then of course neurons connect and disconnect through synapses, right? And Ledoux's research in neuroscience is that emotions are produced through synapses. So it's not so much between neurons as between synapses. What happens in that synaptic space is what determines how emotions are produced and processed, and of course that informs how we behave, and which by extension informs who we are at a social, cultural level, also political level. So by bringing in Ledoux, by citing Ledoux, by drawing on Ledoux, what Malabou is trying to say is that it is not only sufficient that we look at constructive plasticity or constructive formation of neurons. It is also important for us to understand the destruction of neurons, right? How neurons destroy from each other or disconnect from each other, the synaptic zones. And if synapses determine how we behave, if synapses determine our emotional self, is equally important for us to understand the configuration and deconfiguration of synapses, how they disconnect or get disjointed from each other at a synaptic space, synaptic level. The inscription of a death drive in the brain as an emotional coldness is thus not only visible among those with brain injuries, schizophrenics, serial killers, trauma victims, and all of the figures of social exclusion, it is also potentially present as a threat to each one of us. So, as we mentioned a little while ago, it's a possibility, a potential that we always already carry in us, the possibility of emotional coldness, a complete systemic shutdown, which is not death, by the way. It's not suicide, by the way. It's just an emotional shutdown, a coldness, a flatness at a cognitive level, right? And it's not just there in figures who suffered medical injuries or social exclusion, but also people in a normal, quote-unquote normal people, whatever that normalcy means or entails. But that quality of emotional coldness, that quality of disconnect, that quality of disjointedness is always already there, all of us, and at a very medical, biological level it is there. And what Malabou is saying here is it is time for us to acknowledge and articulate it at a social, functional, ontological level, give it a name, give it a classification, acknowledge it as something which we always carry in us all the time as normal functioning selves. So contemporary neurobiological discourse would benefit from a more radical meditation on Spinoza's formulation that no one has so far determined what the body can do, right? So this idea of the uncertainty about the body, that the fact that we don't quite know what the body can do, or more importantly, in this particular case, what the body can undo, right? So the undoing and doing go hand in hand. Destruction and construction go hand in hand. And the focus in neuroscience, the focus in philosophy, especially philosophy around cognition, has been around the constructive self and how the self constructs itself cognitively. But what Spinoza had anticipated, and that's the reason why he is so important for us today, and how Malabou is connecting Spinoza with contemporary neurobiology, is how the idea of the deconstructive self is also important for cognition. In order to study immersion, we must be also able to calibrate and understand and interpret emotional coldness, emotional flatness, or emotionlessness. In other words, at a philosophical level, absence must also be studied, absence must also be articulated, absence must also be acknowledged in our understanding of the self. So self is not just about presence, it's not just about the production of presence. The self is also about the production of absence at a very core ontological level. And a study of the production of absence, emotionlessness, not just as a passive reaction to trauma, emotionlessness as an active production against trauma, is something which we ought to study for a fuller understanding of how trauma affects us medically, neurally, as well as existentially. So it's a very rich framework, as I'm sure you'd agree, and we'll just continue reading this and hopefully wind it up in the next couple of sessions. Thank you for your attention.